Hey, hey, hey. Hi, everyone. It's Dr. Katie Woodley here, holistic veterinarian and founder of The Natural Pet Doctor. I'm going to give people just a minute to jump in. However, drop in the comments where you're joining us from. I see a few of you here, which is amazing. And as you can see, I have an amazing guest joining me, which is probably why you're here. So drop it in the comments where you're joining us from. And also, too, we will be doing questions. So you have a nutrition expert here. Hey, Resilient Abril, you're joining us from Massachusetts. So think about those questions because you can also drop them in the comments, and we're going to make sure that we answer as many of those as we can today too. But I wanted to give my guest, Billy, an amazing introduction. So I'm going to probably make him laugh too when I butcher where he comes from. So just FYI. Hey, Melinda, great to see you. Park City, David, Rochester, New York. It's where my mom was born and grew up. I spent a lot of summers in Rochester as a kid. Megan, Arizona, it's great to see you guys. But Billy Hoekman is my amazing guest today. And he's the vice president of nutrition and communication for Green Juju. And he's involved in formulation, product development, working with farmers, science education, and sales and marketing. He participates frequently in expert panels and speaks nationally and internationally in venues ranging from universities and conferences to public libraries. He served on the board of directors for multiple organizations. He attends AFCO meetings and has numerous published articles. He's a trusted pet health advocate that specializes in turning hard to understand nutrition concepts into plain English. I know he's helped me understand quite a few things. And he lives in Lancaster, Pennsylvania.
That was an interesting way to say it.
Lancaster is what I wanted to say. Lancaster.
That's pretty good. That's pretty good. That's
Okay,
actually
better
pretty
than
good.
what I said the first time around. So, but he lives there with his wife, Emily. Their adorable, gorgeous little daughter, Maple, and their really cute dog, Huckleberry. So if you haven't seen them, make sure you check them out on social media. They're adorable. And I appreciate everyone joining. Hey, El Marie, it's great to see you. Connecticut. I got to meet you recently. So I'm very, very excited, Billy, for you to be here to take time out of your busy schedule. Billy's also a good friend and colleague. So I appreciate you taking the time to share a little bit more and help people understand pet nutrition. And we're going to be talking about diets and a lot of the testing that you've done in terms of like breaking down different proteins and the types of fats and which are more prevalent. And I think there's a lot of like, people don't really understand this area, right? You've kind of uncovered a lot of things recently, and just listening to you speak at some of the recent events, live events that I've been at, you've kind of shifted the way I approach pet nutrition and like formulations and things like that. So I'm super excited about this conversation.
Well, I do appreciate that, and I appreciate you having me here. It's always, I like to pester you and be like, "Hey, I have this idea, so let me get this out there." Yeah, I think fat is always one of my favorite things to talk about, and I thought there was a pretty unique thing that we could kind of look at, and I feel like both in human nutrition and also in dog and cat nutrition, there's this term that goes around that's like healthy fats, and people generally think of things as like they'll be like avocado or this or salmon or whatever their definition of a healthy fat is. But I think that often implies that fat is not healthy at its nature, at its base, and then we have to find healthy versions of that fat. But what I would actually argue, and especially when we look at some of the stuff that we're going to look at today, that all fats that come from nature, when found in the natural correct proportions, especially when you're talking about animals and raising them correctly, are healthy.
Mm.
Um, and those are some of the ones we're going to go over. And I think some of the things that we don't think about, because I think most of the time when we talk about uh, the fat in a diet, we just have this vague idea of it exists and omega-3s are healthy. And
Mm.
so I feel like that's, omega-3s are obviously a part of it, but that's something we're not going to really dive too much into today because I feel like we dive into that a lot. And so, yeah, I just love fat, and here I am. So that's kind of
And you eat a lot of healthy fats, right? And maybe some like, I know, like, for example, in my family, we have a lot of human health practitioners and they refuse to eat eggs. And I'm just like,
Yeah,
so it's fascinating, right? Like your egg yolks, it leads to high cholesterol. It's going to clog your arteries, and it's fascinating. So it's always really good reminder that you mentioned nature, what nature
yeah.
gave us, not synthetic, and what we tweak and change, and because we typically don't do it better than what nature gave us.
Well, yeah, and also there's this little known organization called the USDA who actually rescinded their cholesterol recommendation. Because if you look at the wide variety of evidence available on cholesterol, just generally, you find that food from cholesterol doesn't actually affect your cholesterol, or at least 80% of it. So the idea that eating more cholesterol, say from eggs, just isn't actually true, unless you have some, uh, severe genetic predisposition or something like that. And I think if I had to guess, I would think that give it 10 or 15 years, but the saturated fat recommendation will also be taken away eventually as well. But so that's something you can tell your family. That would be a great Thanksgiving for next year conversation. I'm sure.
We'll bring it to Christmas when we're all together, and there's even more like medical human doctors there at the table too. It'll be really fun. We're like
Exactly right.
stirring the pot. Awesome.
That's that's
I can't see your screen to bring it
no,
up.
yeah, no. I
So,
have to go back to it. Okay, so let me. Um,
so Billy's going to share some information and slides. This is all also being recorded. So if you're joining us from YouTube, make sure that you like and subscribe so that you can get notified when we do release new content. We usually do weekly coffee talks with the doc every Friday on different health topics too. And then we also interview people who are doing amazing things in the pet industry, like Billy and other practitioners and colleagues. So definitely check that out so you stay on top of the latest. Oh, hey, Debbie. Great to see you from Virginia. And Amy, Roberta from Orlando. Um,
Sorry, now I'm trying to figure it out. So this is good because we had it. Give me 1 second here.
it'll come back. It's all good. Technology. So while Billy's figuring that out, this week for our coffee talk with the doc, I'll be talking about the mysterious canine respiratory illness that a lot of people are terrified about, and giving you some tips and tools on how to support, optimize, and even naturally treat uh, using food as medicine and other supplements, and giving you all the details that we have. So make sure you join us on Friday for our coffee talk with the doc. It'll be 9 a.m. Mountain Time, and it's also recorded. So you can always catch any of these by coming back and watching. Hey, Rebecca, all the way from Ireland. All right, I'm seeing it now, Billy. So it's great.
Okay, can
Okay,
you see
perfect.
it?
I
Are we
can.
good?
Yep, there we go. Perfect. All right.
Okay, so if there's any questions, any relevant questions during, I can't actually see anything. So if there's any questions during, please interrupt, especially if you have any questions. But if there's any questions, that obviously we'll take some questions at the end too. But if there's any questions, feel free to interrupt me. And it does help me actually, because it is kind of hard not to see anything. But I will do the best I can. So again, thank you so much for having me. The title of this presentation is Nature's Ratios, the Detailed Fat Makeup of Meat-Based Diets. Now, I will tell you where this presentation comes from is the fact that, so we have 6 freeze-dried diets on the market. We just released goat and lamb. And we did something that was very special, I think, for the industry at large, which is we didn't actually add any omega fatty acid supplements to the product in order to balance it. And so in doing that, we wanted to say, like, it's sort of twofold. Number one, we're relying on sort of nature's ratio of omega 3 to 6, but we're also showing people that you don't have to take our word for it that these animals are raised correctly, because we get the ratios that come from animals that are ethically raised correctly and are eating what they should be eating. So in doing this, we didn't just test the omega-3 to 6 ratio of these because those are just two fats. Well, actually, those are two fat categories, I should say. And then, omega-3s is multiple things, omega-6 is all of those things. Everything always breaks down into something, far more complicated when it comes to nutrition, but I hope to kind of clear that up. But what we did was the full fatty acid testing on all of this. And what that gives you is a really cool glimpse into not just our food. So this will be information that pertains specifically to our food, of course, because it's what we actually tested, but what pertains to the fat makeup of the animals that we use. So in this case, that's beef, pork, rabbit with duck liver. That's whole rabbits, and that'll make for some interesting things coming up. It is so I said bison, lamb, and goat. And so the cool thing is, if you're using our products, you can get a sort of a better idea of what you're dealing with. But if you're not as well, especially since we're using high amounts of organ meat, you're also going to get an idea of how you can kind of take some of the things you learned today. And that's kind of the basis of everything I talk about, which is obviously some of this stuff is going to be inclusive in the Green Juju products because me and Kelly make all of the Green Juju products. But you never have to buy anything Green Juju related in order to learn from my presentations, and hopefully you guys feel the same way about that. So we are looking at this sort of from an evolutionary standpoint. So the first point is that, like, we're relying on the meat themselves. Now there is definitely you could say, oh, well, this is industrialized meat because we're not getting wild animals, but that is true, but it is also not sort of true because about 50% of our goat is actually wild harvested, which makes for a really interesting nutrition profile. And it's actually very, very similar in the macro makeup of the fats that we're going to talk about. It's a very similar makeup, especially in macro versus micro. So I think that these are very, very close to nature's sort of fat ratios. The omega-3 to 6 ratio in prey animals typically tends to, I think, average out at like 1 part omega-3 to 5 parts omega-6. But obviously there's going to be a base range of those things. But we today are not really going to focus on omega-3 and 6. They're kind of a side thing because I think we talk about those things a lot. So the first thing that
so too, just to interrupt you briefly, we
yeah.
talked about it I think it was a couple months ago, one of the last talks that we did, we actually talked about omega-3s and 6s. So we have another video that people can check out too for that more information. The other thing too, you did mention, and I just want to clarify for people watching, you mentioned the macro and micro. What, like, in just like one sentence or less, like what would be a brief explanation of what you mean by that?
What I mean by macro is the total makeup of the groupings of fat. So you could say omega-3s are X percentage, but omega-3s aren't one thing. So you could break those down into the different types of omega-3s, wherein a good example of that would be like if you look at a diet and say this diet is 50% protein, there's many proteins that make up that protein, but protein would be the macro part of it. And in this case, I'm referencing the micro part would be like the specific amino acids.
Perfect.
So very similar to that. So the first thing we're going to talk about, my favorite food is on there, by the way, which is butter. But a side note, butter is the healthiest fat and is just the most demonized food just for humans. But a lot of those things are the same for dogs and cats as well. But the first thing we're going to talk about that's notable, and the reason why this is notable, these two fat types that we're going to talk about here, is because nature made them notable. It doesn't have to be that I love them. It doesn't have to be that it's just I like butter. It does have to just be it's coming from the natural, which you'll see in the testing slides on this. But it is important to talk about why they're so important. Saturated fats are super interesting. So they're called saturated fats, and the reason why they say you should cook with, why people traditionally say cooked with butter and lard and things like that is because the saturated fat is a saturated cell structure. So the outside of the actual fat itself is more saturated. So it's going to oxidize less. It's going to break down less. And that's where that term comes from. So saturated fats make up about 50% of our cell membrane. So 50% of the things that make you up are made of saturated fat. And you need more saturated fat, and your dog and cat needs more saturated fat than any other fat to be healthy. And we'll see exactly what that looks like. One really interesting thing about saturated fat in general is that it helps to assimilate calcium into the skeletal structure. It's necessary, and the best ratio that that happens in is 50% of your daily intake of fat, or your dog and cat's daily intake of fat, being saturated. Um, and so obviously we see a lot of value there as well. Saturated fat is the main fat that protects the liver from toxins and helps liver function just generally. Um, and it is needed to utilize other essential fatty acids. The other thing that I really want to sort of like have you guys understand from this presentation is that, one of the things I talked about a lot this year was not medicinizing food. And that means let's not pull out individual things. So
Mhm.
this isn't a thing where you say to yourself, oh, I need to make up my entire dog's diet of saturated fat. Every single fat that's found in nature, that's especially found in the native diet of carnivores like we're feeding, is necessary. And you'll see the fatty makeup of those things. But saturated fats are needed to utilize for your dog or cat's body to utilize omega-3 and 6 fatty acids, which are essential, which means you have to actually consume them. Now, saturated fats can be produced in the gut, but it's better if you ingest them and the body doesn't have to produce them. It's sort of like vitamin D. Your body can produce it, but it's better if you just eat it. That's why I take my raw cod liver oil every morning. Um, and so that's my time to bring up the time that my daughter refused to drink chocolate milk and likes her raw milk with cod liver oil in it better. So that will be my bragging point. I'll be telling that story when she's like 20. So
It's amazing. It's definitely not the norm with today and children and what they eat. So it's absolutely amazing.
100%. Yeah, they're very, and actually, just total side note. Um, this week we're feeding my daughter goes to Montessori school. We're feeding her class bunny, Mr. Happy, this week. We're the family that gets to bring in the fresh greens and whatnot. So I'm getting really into that as well. So we'll see where that goes.
Love
I
it.
was like, we have to have the most bougie stuff possible for Mr. Happy. Um, so this, like other fats as well, also has antimicrobial properties in the gut. So um, this is where we get into uh, pathogens in the gut and controlling pathogens in the gut generally. And saturated fat, like fat in general, is a great source of energy. Um, so this is just like the very, very tip of the iceberg when it comes to some of the benefits of these things. You could do a whole talk on just saturated fat. You could do a whole talk on just the next thing that I'm going to talk about that I think people don't talk about enough. But I think that, the general makeup of your body and the 50% cell membrane, which is the first point, really shows people that this is something that is very important. And again, these fat types are notable, which you'll see in a second. So the other thing we're going to talk about here is omega-9 fatty acids. So most people are familiar with olive oil and olives in general, probably olive oil because olive oil is a fat. That's where they're finding this mostly, but this is the most abundant in nature when it comes to like the omega fatty acids, which you'll see in a second. So this is non-essential, which means that your dog's body can produce it, you can produce it. But again, it goes back to it is best to eat these things. And this is one of the main functions of omega-9 fatty acids is it's needed to make sure that the cell membrane is thick enough. So again, I want to go back to it's never just a silver bullet. It's, saturated fat is in 50% of the cells that make up your body, but also you need this omega-9 fatty acids, which to make sure that the cell membrane is thick enough. So it's all sort of like an interconnecting puzzle. And there's never like, I'm a strong believer in there's sort of never, hey, you need this much omega-9 to this much saturated fat to this, because every dog and cat is different as well. This has also been shown to be protective against cognitive decline, promoting brain function. But that's really true of every naturally occurring fat as well. So if you go into like, medium chain fatty acids, which we'll touch on briefly, omega-3s, those sorts of things, whatever they study. And that's because your dog and cat's brain is made of mostly fat. And so that makes sense because you're sort of, remaking those cells. And I couldn't not put something about raw milk in my presentation for sure, even though we're talking about fats in meat diets today, but 25% of the fat in raw goat's milk is also these same omega-9 fatty acids. And if it's in raw milk, you know that it's A, in nature, and B, in nature for a purpose, because, obviously milk is created to sustain an animal completely. So why did we talk about omega-9s and saturated fat in this case? That's because we learned some very interesting things so we're going to go over each of these different types here. So we learned some interesting things when we did the full fatty testing on this. And the other thing about this too is like, this is just like, even from the data points that we looked at, this is just a really brief explanation of it. There's a lot of other cool points that go into how we make our foods and why we make our foods. So if you look on the top right here, this is actually the breakdown. So this is grass-fed beef. So this is cows that eat grass, which is their native food to eat. So this is going to produce the best ratio. This ratio, if you're comparing the omega-3 to 6 right there, is going to be like a 1 to 4, a 1 to 3 on average, which is a grass-fed ratio. But the first thing that should jump out at you there is that the omega-9s dwarf both the omega-3 and the omega-6s. So obviously, evolutionarily, from that perspective, prey animals in the wild, that sort of thing, they're all going to be much, much higher in omega-9s, which would lead me to believe that all of those benefits sort of outweigh what we find in omega-3 and 6s. Now, it is important, obviously, to make sure that the omega-3 to 6 ratio is, lower. But this would actually lead me to believe that omega-9s are more important from an evolutionary perspective, which I think is very interesting because I don't really think we talk about them that much. And then we can look at the saturated fats versus omega fatty acids. So here we have beef, and we have almost a 50-50 ratio, which you will see, what's what I'm looking for, a pattern here with this. But the interesting thing about that is you're looking at the omega-3 fatty acids, and then you're looking at them in comparison to saturated fats. So going back to what I was talking about before, that calcium assimilation into the bones at 50% saturated fats, this is the natural ratio of, say, grass-fed beef. And that grass-fed beef is slightly more than 50% saturated fat. So that's, I think, an interesting point. There's two other things on the slide that we're going to talk about as well. So I'm just looking at the time here. So the first one is called C15. This is rather obscure and rather new, but I think it's kind of cool to talk about. So you see that there we have 60 milligrams per ounce. So C15 is a type of fat that is there's some research that's showing it's a newly discovered essential fatty acid. It's actually a saturated fatty acid. And essential means your body has to have it to function. And so the interesting thing about it is one of the main factors in strengthening your cell's ability to create energy. It has a lot of benefits, and they all are in tune sort of in the same way that omega-3 is. But if you look at it, some of the studies that were done here were done with EPA, which is a particular omega-3 fatty acid. And EPA is, I would argue, not the most efficient. I don't know if that's the right word, but most efficient omega-3 fatty acid. I would say that DHA is that, but both of them work in conjunction with each other. But these particular studies looked at EPA. And so this found that within this C15 fat, there were 36 cellular benefits. It was 3 times more than EPA. It repaired 10 out of the 12 different cell types, which is 2.5 times more than EPA does. And it was safe at all doses for the cell types. Now, you'll notice here it says EPA was toxic to 4 of the cell types at the highest doses. That just goes back to my point that no fat is going to be the silver bullet. So we don't look at it and go like, oh, EPA is healthy, so we're just going to load the body up with it. No, they're all meant to be in sort of that natural ratio that's found in animals and fish and in all of those doses. So this one happened to be safe for all cell types at these really high doses that they use in the study. However, this will just go to show you, and very interesting to look at. So if you guys are nerds out there and like to learn more, just looking up this C15. There's starting to be some supplements and things that come out, but very interesting to discover sort of a new essential fatty acid because that hasn't been done in a very long time. And you'll notice this little milk thing down here because I obviously have to go back to milk again. Raw milk is the best source of this. So, spoiler alert, it's usually the case. But so if you're using, say, Green Juju goat's milk, that's my little sales pitch in there. You can also get a lot of the C15 fatty acid, but you'll notice it's in our food as well. Now, there isn't really an established dose for dogs and cats, but when you compare this to the human dose that they've sort of started establishing, it is actually very high in this beef. So keep in mind, this per ounce total, this is a freeze-dried food, so we are removing the moisture. So a good example would be a huckleberry, gets half of his 60% of his diet typically is our freeze-dried food, and that's 1.16 ounces per meal. So, and he's a 28-pound dog. So keep in mind this is somewhat concentrated, but you are getting a good dose of that. The other thing I mentioned on here was lauric acid because I feel like this has come under fire again. Every once in a while, it just comes under fire for some reason. So I wanted to address that. And why did I put that in there? It's because lauric acid is pretty ubiquitous when it comes to all food types. So let's take a look at that as well. So what is lauric acid? Lauric acid is a slightly longer medium chain fatty acid. It is actually classified as medium chain fatty acid. It digests very quickly and is very efficient to use for energy. For those of you that have an animal that is on a ketogenic diet due to cancer or some other health issue or something like that, it produces a lower blood ketone elevation, but it's more sustained over time. So it actually works better in conjunction, say, with caprylic and capric acid, which are medium chain fatty acids. It kills bad bacteria. One study or a couple studies actually showed that it kills bad bacteria, but not probiotic bacteria. And basically, it's in everything you feed your dog and cat. There is nothing you feed your dog or cat that won't pretty much, is if it's animal based or fat based, that will contain. I just realized there's a watermark on this photo. So there you go. Now you know I just found that on Google in the coconut. So
Oh
um,
yeah, you can't really see it, but
no one would have noticed, but I have to be self-deprecating, so it's fine.
I just thought it was a natural part of the coconut.
Yeah, there you go. It's like you carve it in there. So, um, but I use this as an example as well. Raw goat's milk has 35 milligrams per ounce of this, and you'll see in the different slides as well the different amounts of lauric acid that's in there. So the idea that lauric acid exists just in coconut oil, and that you should avoid coconut oil for that reason, just isn't true, because it's in everything. And we found, we knew that, but we have that data with our testing as well. But the best source of this is coconut oil. But again, I want to go back to the fact that, like, if you're going off any study, most of the time when people do studies, they actually take out whatever the ingredient is and then expose the dog or cat or whatever their rat or whatever they're using to that. They don't use, say, coconut oil, they're using lauric acid. And there's a huge difference there. And also, your coconut oil is not going to be the huge makeup of your dog or cat's diet. It's part of all of those fats. So again, if you get into only using coconut oil as the fat in your dog or cat's diet, you might run into an issue, but that's true of anything, because dosage is always everything. So I do want to put it out there that it's in everything you feed your dog or cat. So, and then the other part too that I think is interesting is it's in literally every mammal's milk. So, you know, raw milk is made to be food by biology and evolution, which typically doesn't put things that are bad for the gut lining into them. And so again, it's about dosage, but lauric acid is a very healthy addition to every diet. So you can go back to this and you have a smaller dose, but again, that's what you get, is the full makeup of all of those smaller things. So you can see,
I was
yeah,
going to just jump in because I think that's really, really important what you just said. And it goes with everything that we practice. Like, a true holistic approach isn't just taking like one herb or one piece, and like, your dose matters. It's the whole. That's the important piece. And of course, with nutrition, that's where you run into problems when you're overdosing or using really high amounts, because it's not following kind of that natural, the way nature made it. And the other one, that, because coconut oil is the big controversial thing that always comes up, but the point you made with the studies is really important too, because so many people, they see these studies and they freak out and they shift course. Garlic is another one. Like, the one garlic study that shows like garlic is really, really bad was dosed at super high amounts that a dog would never eat. And then, they measure different levels in the blood. And then all of a sudden we've extracted that now garlic's going to kill your pets and cause bleeding disorders. So we have to look at that and keep that in mind whenever you're looking at research articles and studies and thinking about, how do I best support my pet's overall health? I loved your quote, are you medicinizing your food? And it goes back to this principle of, are you just using one thing, or are you taking a balanced approach? So I just wanted to
yeah.
interject with that.
No, it's a good point. It's sort of like, near and dear to my heart, obviously, on the screen here, Lua's fermented golden paste. Our fat in that golden paste is coconut oil, but that product, well, the feedback we've gotten on it's been incredible for especially senior animals. It's not a huge makeup of the diet, right? You're going to do, say, a half a teaspoon or something like that, because it's concentrated, because the turmeric is fermented. But so, and that's a misconception I see a lot online. Someone will say coconut oil is high in fat. Well, coconut oil is actually a fat, and all fats have 9 calories per gram. They're all exactly the same in that way. So, it is just sort of an interesting side note. And we obviously at Green Juju use coconut oil in our blends and some other things. And we think that, if you take my own personal dog, he gets a good amount of our veggie blends every day, which have coconut oil, but the coconut oil is a smaller amount within that blend. And then that's going to mix with the sardini gets with all of these different fat profiles. So I wanted to highlight lauric acid because I don't want anyone to throw lauric acid under the bus. I get like favorite nutrients, and then I have to, I feel like I have to like protect them. So here is, I'm a dork. So here is the bison recipe. So uh, again, we highlight here. This is actually, if you're looking at that upper right thing, this going back to our other talk, is a 3-to-1 omega 3-to-6 ratio, and it is really interesting to me. I mean, the first two here are grass-fed ruminants, so you may say to yourself, "Oh, that's so interesting," but they are very similar. There's not the biggest difference in the nutrient profile just generally of a bison or a cow. But you'll notice here, and you'll notice here, you get almost the same amount of that C15, and you do actually get more lauric acid, and that's just a result of it being a different animal, or the testing itself, or what that particular bison ate. That was the testing part of that. But again, you see that through line of all of those omega 9s, which I think are really important. So here we go into something that's different, which is the pork. So this is pastured pork. So here you have an 8-to-1, probably slightly lower than that sometimes as well, but I think that's a good place to put it. Omega 3-to-6 ratio, and here you have an even higher amount of omega 9s that make up that diet. And this is the first one where you can genuinely say, because even pigs that are on pasture, we actually are picking up our pig. We get a family pig. We're picking up our cheesemaker raises this pig because we live in the 1860s, and just a side note about pigs, really quick. I was going out to see them because they have a huge pasture. It's the best pork. And I was going out to take pictures of them, and they kind of cornered me, and I thought they were going to like charge me. So I had to get.
They know it's coming.
And it was just me, and I was like, "Oh, if I die by the hands of these pigs, this is going to be really embarrassing for me." So interesting thing about the pork here is that it is much lower in those C15 fats, and that just goes to show you that species wise too, you're going to get different determinants there. But also here, you'll notice that the saturated fats are actually less. So we're actually using mostly heart and liver here, but it's still almost that 50-50 ratio, which is just your basic natural ratio. But you're actually, at least in our case, getting more of a percentage of those omega-3 fatty acids, but it's still right around that 50%. And this is the first one where it's actually like really a different species, because those pastured pigs are still eating feed, right? And so they're still going to affect the omega fatty acid ratio, the macro ratio over time. But you'll notice that the body sort of reverts to that 50-50 thing there. And you might also be saying, well, yes, but these are also like larger animals that are known to be higher in fat than their wild counterparts. But here's a really interesting one, and that is our rabbit with duck liver. Now, this is a significant amount of duck liver in this, but these are whole rabbits that you would get. So if you've ever seen a whole rabbit at the grocery store, it's just the body of it. It's not the fur or anything like that. And it's like if you would buy it to cook a whole rabbit at home, this is what they look like. So this is all of the different muscle parts of the rabbit themselves. And this has I believe in this testing, the highest amount of omega 9s was in because of those rabbits. This is a 7-to-1 omega 3-to-6 ratio. And this is pretty much an exact through line to a 50-50 ratio with the saturated fats and the omega 3 and the omega fatty acids. And that's adding, by the way, all of those three together, which again goes back to that proper assimilation of minerals and calcium. And you'll notice rabbit is very high in lauric acid as well, which is another good point for lauric acid. So this is a really interesting one because this is we just released our goat, and this is as close as you can get, I think, in the industry to a wild protein, because 50% of this is wild, but the other 50% is pasture raised, but their pasture is basically wild. So they're basically on these huge pastures, and they kind of rope them in when they're harvesting. They kind of get them, but it's not very similar. It's in Australia. It's not very similar to, say, the way that we sometimes pasture animals here. So this is 50% wild. Uh, and you see here that we get that same through line with the saturated fats being, and people would think like, oh, goat's really lean. And this is, it's about as lean as the bison, which will tell you something as well. And this is actually a 2-to-1 omega-3 to 6 ratio. So it's probably our least inflammatory food. But again, notice that huge through line with those omega-9s. And this has that same sort of right in that same ballpark of uh, those C15 fats. Now, if you're feeding, this is basically the exact same as when it comes to calories, as our beef and our bison and our pork. And so if you're feeding those things are easy to sort of go between, and you can see the nutritional through line there as well with that. And then lastly, we have our lamb, which is actually our highest calorie offering. And here you can see there is much higher C15, but it is also just much higher in calories in general because it has a higher fat content. The interesting thing about lamb in general is we're basically only using hearts and livers here. It's hearts, livers, and necks for the bone content. And so even at the base of just the heart and the liver, all of the fat associated with that in lamb is just going to be higher in fat than other proteins. A lot of people don't know as well, all the fat around your heart, or this lamb's heart, or your dog's heart is saturated fat. And so I just lost my train of thought. Oh, so with the lamb here, you'll notice the much higher C15 percentage, but also within that, like I said, it is going to be higher. You have your nice lauric acid here. Now, these are completely grass-fed lambs. Let me say it this way. This lamb is completely grass-fed from Australia as well. So you see here, that is nature's. This is just more evidence that is nature's ratio down there of the saturated fats to omega fatty acids. So basically, in conclusion, and I'm going to stop sharing so I can see people again. But all right, did that work? Okay, cool.
Yep, we're back. Yep.
So basically, in conclusion, all fats that come from nature, and you could do a whole presentation on this. Even trans fats that actually come from meat are actually healthy, versus trans fats that are created through, say, like a chemical process. All fats that come from, because if you look at any meat, for example, they'll have something like trans fats in there. All fats that come from nature in reasonable proportions are healthy. Now, where you run into problems is when you run into, say, when you try to, extract a bunch of fat from a small seed that you'd never have in nature, and then have that as your main fat source. So again, I think what the problem comes from the dosing. And the cool thing about what we tested in our foods was that is sort of the evolutionary dosing of those fats. So hopefully that made sense.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating. I know David asked, and I know the answer to this, but I'm going to have you address it. He was looking at your website, and so it looks like they're all dog products. Can you touch on, he's asking about cats?
Yes,
we have quite a few cat people here.
We have not done the cat packaging yet. I don't know exactly what we're going to do with that, but all of our foods are complete and balanced for both dogs and cats. And for all you cat people out there, just to give you a little love, in order to make your food complete for both dog and cats, you kind of have to make cat food and then make it applicable to dogs. And so, for all you cat people out there, freeze dried is a great option. I should mention too, we will have the frozen version of these coming out in March. They'll be the exact same formulas. They'll just be frozen, and for you people with big dogs, they will be a little bit more cost friendly for that reason. So
Awesome. I love that. I use a lot of freeze dried to transition cats' diets off of kibble. So that's another way to use freeze dried, and then you can use it long term. And as you can see, there's not a ton of stuff in this food, so it can make it easy if you have a sensitive animal. What would you say, Billy? Because fats scare a lot of people for a lot of the reasons you've mentioned. But for a pet that's seems like they're like fat sensitive, do you find like your types of diets, or can you touch on that just a little bit? Like if we have a pancreatitis, like a pet prone to pancreatitis, whether it's a dog or a cat, people tend to, and we had a question like with renal disease and avoiding fats, like
mhm.
I have my
Well,
own opinion about like fat tolerance and things like that. But what are you seeing kind of on the research side and with like your diets too? And I know you feed a lot of pets that are fat sensitive.
yeah, well, most of our diets, aside from the lamb, and the rabbit's going to be a little bit lower in fat, but all the other ones, because we're using the same basic formulation with heart, liver, and kidney, and it is something to mention too, just to show people how important fat is that the other ratio you can talk about that we didn't go over was the ratio of fat to protein, which all of ours are basically at the right around the 1-to-1 from a calorie level, which means that you're going to get the same amount of calories from fat and protein, and that's really as low for a healthy animal. That's really as low as you want to go, in my opinion. And so that just shows you that the body, even in those ratios that I just showed you, where we're using formulating in a particular way, that just goes to show you that even though there are diets on the market that have higher fat content, um, even at the low end, the way that dogs and cats' bodies are designed are to use a lot of fat in their calorie makeup. Now, with pancreatitis, I would say that the I guess newer research shows that it's not really about fat as much. I mean, it could be literally about anything, but the prevalence is not in fat, but is in carbohydrate consumption, and then oftentimes the addition of a bunch of fat all at once. But I would say that the main pancreas abuse is carbohydrates at high levels day in and day out, and then that's typically where it comes from. And the example I always give is whenever the story you always hear, which is like my dog had turkey fat on Thanksgiving and now got pancreatitis. Well, it was actually from all of the dry food for so many years. Um, Constantly sort of stressing the pancreas because of the high carbohydrate content. And so the other interesting part with just diet and disease conditions in general is that diet is a pie chart, and you have to make it up with stuff. And when you take out one part or you reduce one part, another part gets bigger. And so I feel like when people have disease conditions, or their animals do, they sort of think to themselves, I want a diet that's moderate fat, moderate protein, and low in carbohydrates. Well, that can't exist, because if you do low protein, low fat, then the carbohydrates are going to be much higher, and vice versa. So I feel like with most disease conditions, you can make up a proper ratio that you want of mainly fat to protein, whatever that ratio is, and then kind of stick. I'm a pretty big advocate for low carbs. Our foods are very low in carbohydrates, and even when you add our vegetable blends, they're still very low in carbohydrates. Um, so I think you can find a good diet within that scheme, that spectrum, at any
That's
level.
great. Yeah. And there is a question by L Marie talking about hemp oil. I think she's talking about like flaxseed oil too. You know, I see a lot of companies where they'll add like flaxseed into their recipes, even like raw food companies. Can you touch? It's a very general. She's asking, why are you using hemp oil or flax oil to begin with? Is it not healthy, or is it healthy? Do we need to do that? Because I find a lot of people add, once again, it's, lots of people are overusing omega-3s, but then also too, they're using like flaxseed because flax is more common in the human realm, right? Like a healthy
Yeah.
oil. So, can you touch on like that type of fat a little bit?
Yeah, there's a couple things. I think a lot of times it's used probably because it's less expensive, but and because you can sort of like it's all in sort of like marketing. You see it in the human side all the time, and it's just kind of disingenuous. Like they'll be like, flax has more omega-3s than salmon, but it does. But again, that's just the macro picture. Those all come in what's called ALA, which are healthy and good, and you need them, but they're not. But in order to perform most of the things you need for your dog or cat, they have to be converted into EPA and DHA, and so it's much better to just give foods that have EPA and DHA and ALA in them, which are basically animal foods, unless you're like Adored Beast makes a good like algae
Yeah.
EPA and DHA supplement. Um, and that's not to say that those things can't be a healthy addition to a diet, but you would not want to use that as your primary source um, of omega fatty acids for that reason. And it's the same thing with people too. You also have to convert them. You're probably better at doing it than your dog, but I wouldn't say by very much. So that's probably why people are doing it. So I would recommend something, animal based over that.
Yeah. I agree 100% with that. I feel like I see a lot of health issues with people like over supplementing one thing, just like what you're saying, versus using whole food sources. I know you're a huge fan of raw goat milk. I don't know if anyone picked up on that during this presentation,
No.
but not at all. But you always go back to it, and you go back to it for a certain reason because it's like the whole food source of all these amazing vitamins, minerals, nutrients, fats. The micro and the macro. Um, I think David has a great question. I see this a lot. I can see both sides of it. Is weight gain typical on a raw food diet? I mean,
I would say no. I would say it's a lot easier to keep your animal thin on a low carb diet. But there's a genetic factor in there, and there's those dogs that just put on weight fairly easily, and then
microbiome too. Microbiome.
that's
So
a very good point. Yeah, I
yeah,
would say like in the presentation, I think I did like 3 or 4 throughout the year. So I think the one you were at, one of the things to talk about was the 3 pillars of what I think are a good diet, and they're all equally as important. And it was fat, protein, and the microbiome and whole food probiotics. And so I really do believe, I would say it's always kind of funny because I can't ever like when it comes to my own dog, I can't ever say exactly what I'm doing because it's like secret things that could end up being products or whatever. But like, I at this current moment, I'm probably doing like 5 different. I just go between them, but different whole food probiotic sort of things, and it's all just reverts back to food. Like I don't know if he's on any supplements. Um, so I think I've kind of whittled it down to that. Although it was kind of funny because I think last time I talked to you, I think he wasn't able to do milk, but I think I fixed his gut and
yeah,
he is good with milk now. But it was funny because I was like, oh, I'm just gonna do this like really cool diet. It's just gonna be just milk, eggs, sardines, like just these like just very nutrient dense foods. I did it like 6 days in a row, and like 2 times in a row, he was so disappointed. He came over and the look on his face was like, oh God, not this again. So I was like, all right. So I gave him like food again because I was like, you just enjoy it more. And I think that that's something we miss too, is like, what do our dogs and cats like just enjoy?
yeah,
And so I thought it was like an interesting, he was just so disappointed,
yeah,
which says a lot because he's a pretty happy, goofy French
yeah.
bulldog. So
We have a cat like that too, where if I use the same raw food, he walks away, and then you have to top it with certain things and freeze dried and all of that. I think the other piece too to David's question is like comes down to like you were talking about um fat calories also, and they're going to be different in different foods, like calorie content per amount. And so if you change over the food and you're like, well, I'm using the same amount, there's probably a different amount of calories in that amount of food you're feeding. And that can lead to weight loss. It can lead to weight gain. And then looking at these other factors too that we're talking about with like the microbiome, the digestion, all those other things that come into play too with weight. But keeping in mind, like each diet is different. Like even your different types of diets with Green Juju are different different calories. So that's another thing to keep in mind when you're looking and changing diets. If your cat or dog is gaining or losing weight. So yeah, I think those are all great questions, amazing information, something for us to chew on this Monday morning after our Thanksgiving feast. So anything else that you feel like would be helpful for people navigating the space with like the fats and that type of thing that you want to leave them with?
I think even in the holistic space, the more we can base this on whole foods with natural ratios, be it whatever makes up your animal's diet, even in the supplemental realm, the better we're going to be off. And I think that that's sort of the direction we need to go. So, and if anybody wants to reach out to us with questions, if you email info@greenjuju.com, I get all of the nutrition questions. So feel free to reach out anytime.
Awesome. So, and that's also where you can get products, reach out to your local stores, your pet food stores, have them connect with Billy so that they can carry the product too. It's one of the best ways to help spread amazing products that we learn about and get them more accessible for other people. So definitely have those conversations with your natural pet food stores if they're not carrying Green Juju. It's just an awesome brand for both dogs and cats, even though it doesn't necessarily say cats. Keep that in mind. Share that with other people too. And Billy, thank you so much for your time and taking, a little bit of your time to educate and help support pets and all the things that you do and creating amazing products to help pets truly thrive. And truly appreciate you as a human and all the goodness that you create. And then also to thank you everyone for taking time out of your day to learn more. Please share this information with other pet parents too, so that we can keep spreading the word. Share it with your veterinarians also. That's how we change and keep this movement going. So once again, I'm Dr. Katie Woodley, the natural pet doctor. And thanks again, Billy, for joining us today.
Thank you. Everybody have a good night.
All right, bye.